Hello, everybody. You got quite a few people up on the camera. Paula's the one talking. Welcome to the Mortgage Quality and Compliance webinar. We're so excited that we're still able to do this wonderful webinar that we had to move from last month. So we're very excited to share all of this information with you. But first off, we're going to start off from hearing from our sponsor, our committee sponsor, from Monica. Go ahead, Monica.
Great. Thanks so much, Paula. I'm with Crosscheck Compliance, and we are a proud and active member of the California Mortgage Bankers Association. If you're watching and you're not a member, please join. At Crosscheck, we have a team of qualified industry professionals with broad, deep, and specific mortgage experience. Currently, we're providing a variety of services. Hot topic areas are fair lending, fair servicing, loan reviews, and we also are doing due diligence for your securitizations, especially in the non-QM space. So our depth of experience distinguishes us from others, and we partner with law firms on engagements as well under attorney-client privilege. And I love to network in the industry, hoping to see a lot of folks at next week's Western Secondary Conference. So don't hesitate to reach out to me to connect directly if you have questions. And I'm excited about this panel because I am a hawk on insurance, and there's going to be a lot of great stuff for us to learn. So thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Monica. And thank you for pointing out, if you are not a member of the California MBA, definitely recommend joining. They have great resources, and also, I mean, you get to connect with some really great people. And if you want to join, you could email Susan at CMBA or Samantha at cmba.com. So today we have a wonderful presentation about cybersecurity. Do not wait for the ransom demand. We laughed about the title, but it's very true because none of us are safe. I mean, we may all think we are, and especially I'm in compliance. I don't know very much about cybersecurity. I'm just assuming that my IT has it all in hand, which they do, of course. But as compliance folks, this is a great time for us to learn more about cybersecurity. And also, if you're on the IT side, you're also going to gain a lot of information also. So I'd love to turn this over to Michael Snelling so that you can proceed with this wonderful webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you, Paula, for the introduction. Also, thank you to CMBA, Susan, Sam, MQAC committee, and most importantly, all of you for attending today. My name is Michael Snelling with Hub International, along with my esteemed colleague here, Danny and Gemma from Hub, members of the CMBA, actively involved, trying to get more involved as every week passes. We have the pleasure of introducing some very, very high-level speakers here today on the call. We'll start with Brian Schneese, who is Senior Risk Consultant with Hub International, Matt Donovan, Senior Vice President with Amwins Brokerage, and Michelle Bushman, who is the Chief Information Officer at American Pacific Mortgage. I know I can't see your hands raised, but we'll pretend here for the sake of a webinar. And I already know the answers, but if you've seen a story in the news in the last 12 months in regards to a breach, a hack, something related to a cyber issue, raise your hand. Okay, I know everybody's hands just hit the ceiling. And then for those of you who carry cyber liability, how many of you have seen an increase in your annual premiums over the last 12 to 24 months? All right, we're 2 for 2. So cyber-related matters are at the forefront of insurance headaches in the last 24 to 36 months due to various reasons such as media coverage, remote working conditions due to COVID, and the increased presence of domestic and international terrorists that are preying on vulnerable companies. The hard part about cyber is that nothing is set in stone when it comes to cybersecurity. The threats are constantly evolving every day due to new software programs, gaps in existing software programs. They have their own communication network where they share about who is a good target, who is an easy take for some money if they do a ransomware attack on the dark web. And it even boils down or extends to 14-year-old Johnny Neighbor, who just got his Wi-Fi access back after being grounded for 3 months because he didn't get good grades in school. What this does is this makes the risk management and mitigation battle a constantly moving target as well. While the first line of defense it starts internally with all of your policies, procedures, enforcement. It extends to partnering with an agent who understands the importance of coverage nuances, has resources to provide to extend additional value to your organizations, maintains relationships. And yes, despite all this talk about technology, our industry is still a relationship business. And this goes to creating a product and creating a solution for your entities that is the most comprehensive product or solution available out on the marketplace. You can have an insurance policy, it says, here's your limit, and that's great. But until you read the other 90 pages within your policy, you really don't know what you have. And unfortunately, that typically comes when you have a claim. So the three-tiered relationship and how they work hand in hand is going to be what we discuss today. With that, I'm going to kick it over to Brian Schneese to begin his portion of the presentation. We will extend to Matt Donovan and then to Michelle to wrap it up on your all level from the lending industry. So with that, Brian, please take us away.
Hey, thank you. Brian Schneese, just a quick thumbs up. You can hear me okay? Awesome, thank you. Brian Schneese, within our risk services division here at Hub, my full-time job to support clients with risk management, program development, and all the various initiatives that fall underneath that. Going to be talking about cyber today. By professional background, I'm a former FBI special agent, spent a number of years out in Los Angeles working white-collar crime. Had the good fortune of also working for Fortune 50 company, Target, for almost a decade in their loss prevention. So that's a little bit about myself. And I would say on the next slide, let's jump into it. So here you go. This is going to be one of the most intense problems that you're going to lead through in your professional career, being hacked. And we're going to go a little bit deeper. There's a lot more than just being hacked in terms of different threat vectors. But we wanted to start with just basically setting the table. We've curated a number of examples of how this is impacting organizations today, very specifically. So as we push through this on the next slide here, really just want to set the table for what this impact is looking like. And if you go forward one more, I'm going to go through these rather quickly here, but I think you'll find them insightful. Hopefully you'll also pick up something that resonates with your organization as well. I mean, you talk about reputation, Equifax, they basically sell trust, and they put a huge spotlight on the business and legal risks of bad security when they lost 150 million American identities. They also settled for the biggest fine in agency history, the FTC settlement, $700 million. Now, Maersk went down very hard. They are a global shipping company. They were hit with NotPetya, and that malware in about 2 weeks ended up costing them almost $400 million. Next slide. Think about supply chain. I know we all heard back, I think it was Memorial Day last year, JBS hack. They represent a fifth of our nation's meat processing capacity. And what was interesting about this to me was that union officials within the organization were describing how they were disrupted. They said they couldn't even weigh poultry or sharpen knives. So from an operational standpoint, extremely disruptive event for them. Now, who hasn't heard of Colonial Pipeline? Of course, I think the headline, that everyone keys in on is that it was just one password that allowed access. But something you might not know is that when they were making the decision as to whether and how and when to shut things down, they weren't all that affected operationally. Things were working functionally. It was their billing system that was compromised and ultimately was the deciding factor for why they had to shut down. Moving on here to the next slide. Now, Target is not a new or recent example. I know that, but I was there in 2013 when they were breached. That was not my fault, thankfully. But what I want to highlight here, everybody remembers that. And as you and I were hearing about free credit monitoring for the first time, that organization was going through a massive recovery crisis that was extremely impactful. So you might have remembered that they were pushing into the Canadian market. They had retail stores built. they had to stop. They pulled out, completely abandoned that. That's an enterprise level strategy. And so in addition to that, remember they laid off, I think, 2 or 3 C-suite leaders and also had to let half of headquarters go. All of that was in part fallout from the cyber breach that they experienced, and it really changed how they viewed things. It was a paradigm shift for those within the organization. This is sort of a veiled advertisement for this philosophy of enterprise security risk management, which says, as someone said it earlier on the call, this is an IT thing. It's not just an IT thing. This is a risk that's impacting at the highest strategic enterprise level. So that really changed the way that organization approached this, and I think it's a lesson to be learned. Now, they made it through there in large part due to their size, I believe. Travelex, not as lucky. In addition to the effects from COVID and airports being shut down, they get hit with the ransomware, they go out of business. On the next slide, more recent disruptive event here, Kronos, my organization felt this one as well. Think about your clientele. In this case, a tech company and a service provider, weeks-long outage. I can tell you on the front lines here, very few were ready with a backup plan for their third-party payroll provider on how to manually run payroll. So there was a whole lot of leading and managing on the fly here, which is not a great place to be, from a risk management lens. Blackout. So think about this from an investment standpoint. You wake up and your portfolio company as a private equity firm has suffered a ransomware attack. I think at last count, they're still managing through something like 23 lawsuits. And finally here, just as we sort of lay the landscape in the next slide, I wanted to highlight 2 sort of compliance focused examples. Everybody loves to beat up on Robinhood, but of course, or maybe you'd heard, they ended up paying a huge fine. And in the SEC filing outlining it, they cited very specific deficiencies in cybersecurity, lack of an incident response plan, lack of true business continuity planning. That was interesting to hear that called out. And then 2 examples here that I think represent a trend that I just wanted to call out. There's a perspective that says that a national security perspective, a government perspective that says we shouldn't be where we are today in terms of this risk. When you hear about things like Colonial Pipeline, 1Password takes the whole thing down. There's a point of view that says we've elevated these cyber attackers and these hacks into act of God-like status. And that line of thinking sort of absolves leaders, government agencies, everybody from taking responsibility for this. So that line of thinking is driving an increased trend in the regulatory environment. You've got Homeland Security and TSA outlining very specific new requirements. FTC, which we'll talk about later, amends their safeguards rule to include perhaps several of you on this call. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But again, I think you're going to see what we're seeing in this industry comes out with information circulars that moves into new regulations. A year later, it's now enforcement. And that's a trend I think we can expect in other industries and across the board. So hopefully that helps get us all in the right mindset in terms of what this is, how this is impacting. And as we move forward here, wanted to also shift the conversation into how you can lose it. And this is a very simplified approach. Really, nothing's happened. There are ways that you can be compromised. And we talk a lot about hacking and phishing, but I wanted to just cover a couple examples. So as we move into the next slide here, this is not a hack. This is more like carelessness. You've got, as an example here in the next slide, you've got a teenage ethical hacker who uncovers the fact that COVID test results include a backdoor, like in the URL, include a backdoor to see everybody's test results. I would love my kids, by the way, to become teenage ethical hackers. Sounds like there's a ton of money in that. And anyway, but really this was just an accident, right? A faulty backend in a URL allowed a compromise of a whole bunch of personal health information. So that's what we mean by internal accidental. In the next slide, you highlight another avenue, which is really the more malicious internal threat vector. A dated example of this would be like Edward Snowden, in my opinion. But more recently, Tesla's suing a former employee that grabbed a whole bunch of proprietary code on the way out the door. That ends up representing sort of a threat vector. In the next slide, you've got the third-party risk. Should be familiar to most, right? SolarWinds, this is third-party software. We all downloaded it. Well, 33,000 of us downloaded this software, not knowing that it included hacked code, malicious malware that was then infecting other parts of our infrastructure. So again, subcontractor, vendor breaches. And finally, in the next slide, we get to hacking, phishing, extortion attempts. These are about obtaining information, leverage, ransomware. Love testing people with the old, can you spot the difference? Brian Schnese at Hub International, change a couple letters, Hub International, and here you have the basis for a business email compromise, which I'm certain that almost every one of you on this call is experiencing, maybe even on a daily basis as an organization. So I'd suggest ransomware and BEC, or business email compromise, remain public enemy number 1 and 2 in this space. There's just no better way to monetize the illicit access that you've got than encrypting your victims' files and demanding payment. That's where we're at today. Okay, so again, I just want to offer, as we move into this next section here, just a little bit of insight. We've talked about what it feels like trending vectors, but what it'll cost you. And I know my colleagues on the panel here are going to expound on this too. But when you look at some of the ransom trends and the total cost of a breach, I wanted to share a couple interesting statistics on the next slide here. The demand itself, which is one part of the total cost of a breach today, the demand itself has been just skyrocketing over the last 5 years. Here's a quick example. Carrier provided some insight into their policyholders last year, first half of the year, average ransom demand, 1.5 million. In the next half of the year, up 20% to 1.8 million. So staggering numbers on the demand front. Again, that's just one part of the total cost of a breach, at least as shared by the Ponemon Institute and IBM. Average total cost of a data breach in the United States last year, 9.5 million. We love being number 1 in a lot of things. We are number 1 in terms of the highest average cost of a breach in the world, which is not a good number 1. So I just wanted to highlight that as a statistic. Our friends in Canada at 5.4 million. Now in the next slide, I wanted to dive deeper because some of us may actually fall more into the small, medium-sized enterprise. There was a net diligence study that I found really interesting. I wanted to just highlight one thing here. They took a look at something like 6,000 claims from small and medium-sized enterprises, and we're really trying to answer the question, does the size of my organization correlate with the magnitude of loss that I'm experiencing or could experience? And the short answer to that, with all those fancy dots there, is that no, there really is no correlation for small to medium-sized organizations. There might be some with larger. Another way to think about this, one of the biggest incidents, most costly incidents happened to one of the smallest organizations, and vice versa. One of the smaller incidents happened to a bigger organization. Why is that? I think there's a couple of reasons. We've, in the last several years, been experiencing very much an equalizing effect with technology. We've got easy, cheap access to great internet, massive amounts of storage, new technology. And what that's done in terms of a threat landscape, in the days of Target, there were very few who had all of that technology in place. Today, we've all got it. And what that's done in 2021 and 22 is made every one of us in bounds and in play in terms of a potential target for cyber thugs. Okay, so hopefully that's insightful. Moving on now, I want to shift the conversation, and my colleagues do as well. I want to dive into different aspects of this. What do we do about that, right? How do we protect that? And I guess the good news, and many of you will already understand this, there is a framework. And what you see on the next slide is just my version of that. Elements that comprise a comprehensive approach. We talk about specific controls and technical things. We're going to talk MFA and all the different stuff today, but the one ring to rule them all, if you're a Frodo Baggins and Lord of the Rings fan, is your framework and your governance. We're going to get into that. I mean, I'm showing NIST here. That's an easy one to recommend. There are alternatives. I think my colleagues will get into some of this as well. But really, what's your approach? What sort of framework have you put into place to manage all of this? And that's really what this is about. I think with my time, I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into just one aspect. So on the next slide here, I want to go into incident response planning, especially since insurance, carriers, and breach response are sort of converging here. But for those unfamiliar, just want to provide a basis. Today, when you say cyber incident response planning, what you're talking about is a plan that includes outlining what it is you are going to do within the organization, who's going to do what to validate that incident, where and when have you reached the extent of the capabilities that you can provide within an organization, and when do you need to reach outside? When do you engage your insurance broker or your carrier? When do you engage the breach response vendors like a forensics firm, a breach coach, a privacy attorney, and all of that? When a carrier asks, or when someone asks you about a facilitated readiness exercise or a tabletop exercise, that's really just something that you do once you've got a plan in place to bring it from paper and on the shelf into a true capability. What you're doing is you're bringing the team around the table and you're throwing a scenario out there. Today we were hit with ransomware, ready to go. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? What does it say in the plan that we're supposed to do? So that's really what you're getting into. The byproduct or the benefit of going through something like that, even a 1.5 hour, 2 hour session with your team, for sure you're going to come away with things that will improve, enhance, that you want to add to your incident response plan. You're also making your team more equipped, more comfortable to understand what their role in a breach response is. And as we'll get into, there are also some liabilities, some risks in how you manage this. So on the next slide, I just want to highlight one of many things here that I would hope to leave you with is just the consideration of invoking legal privilege where you can. There is a scenario that plays out. Yes, everybody is afraid of encrypting files and their stuff's all locked up, and you're thinking about that from an operational standpoint. That is true. That's an aspect of a ransomware event. The other thing, though, that's going to happen is there will be an exfiltration potentially of sensitive data, and that's your employee data, your client data, something else you're holding, PCI, whatever. When that's exfiltrated and shared, there's been a breach. You're now into notification. Fast forward 12 to 18 months, you now are potentially leading through litigation, maybe a lawsuit, maybe you've been sued. A feature of that, as you're likely aware, is the discovery phase, where they're going to come back and look to the day of disruption. What was being said? What was being typed? How are you talking about your response? As you can imagine, those things can create a liability when you're talking about what you're doing, what you had in place, what you didn't have in place. And so one solve for that is that and in modern breach response planning, many are asking that either in-house counsel or an outside attorney, aka a breach coach or a privacy attorney, is leading or at least engaged throughout the process to offer that privilege. In the next slide, a couple additional trending issues, also with a bit of a claims insurance spin here. Many carriers today are going to ask that you use one of their approved breach response vendors. There's a good reason to do this. They often negotiate preferred pricing, but they may also allow you to have more of a selection or a preference within that. The problem comes when you engage a response vendor, say a forensics firm, that is not on the approved list. So that could cause you trouble as you get through the claims adjudication process. Another requirement of most policies is that you provide timely notice. So you can run into trouble when an imaginary clock starts ticking. Say you just got that phone call. Hey, we're your vendor and we just got a note from you saying to pay this invoice. We paid it and now the money's with the bad guy. So we think you've been breached. Well, you don't know if you've been breached. And so your team's going to go to work validating that. Meanwhile, that does represent in most cases a circumstance which could lead to a claim. And again, so you want to build that into your incident response plan. All of this should inform features, sections, and direction within your incident response plan. Another one, failure to obtain consent to pay a ransom. Everyone should become aware of this thing called the OFAC sanction list, which is a pretty gnarly thing. It's a list of entities, countries, specific entities that our United States government says you cannot negotiate with, and so that will play into the breach response process. There is now a sanctions check that is sort of a modern feature of breach response, and if it's determined that threat actor who hit you is on that list, there may be some restrictions in place in terms of what you can do. And so you want to be prepared for that and have thought through that. Again, another one that very few are ready to handle well is just documenting that business interruption, the loss that's happening after a day of disruption. And so how can you improve your incident response capability to be ready to quickly document and prove the loss and the business interruption that you're experiencing. Just a couple of trending issues we wanted to pass on. And as we move forward into the next slide here, again, this was just one example of something, a ransom negotiation decision tree. It's just sort of a new feature some are building into their response plans. All it does is capture the leadership team's pre-thought out plan for what to do, a helpful guide. This is also a function that a breach coach or a privacy attorney might play for you if you've decided, yeah, we're going to be leaning heavily on what's provided by our carrier or an outside firm. And then I wanted to stop and spend the last just couple minutes here talking about business continuity. And this is applicable from an insurance standpoint in that the carriers are asking for some specific plans. There's a lot of jargon in this. And so on the next slide here, as we get into just differentiating the various plans that exist and that are being asked about and being scrutinized, continuity is one of those. And I wanted to offer, because there's so much in this space in the next slide, just a little differentiation between the plans so that you can perhaps understand what you're in the market for, what you need to focus on. When you think or hear the words emergency action plan or emergency response plan, this is like the document that's hanging on the wall, probably somewhere in a facility or in an office building. Very much evacuation, fire, exits, where are we going to meet, shelter in place. Okay, the IT version of that is often called the IT disaster recovery plan, a very technical set of instructions for turning the lights and the systems back on from an IT standpoint. As you move into crisis management planning, which is really more about what are we going to do as an organization to respond in the next hours of this incident? Who is on my team and who is going to be on this crisis management team and what are they going to be doing? How are we going to be communicating internally with our team and our employees? What are we going to be saying? And how are we going to be communicating outside of our organization? These are all questions that a crisis management plan aims to answer. On the IT side of that, you've got the cyber incident response plan, which we just talked about, right? Who on the team is going to help validate this incident? When are we engaging outside help? Now you move into true business continuity, which is a much heavier, much more in-depth process of identifying the critical functions that support your business. You go deeper and you then identify the underlying dependencies within those. So you're having a paradigm shift as a risk manager or someone thinking about this, going from, was it a tornado? Was it a hurricane? Was it an earthquake? I don't care. I really care what was disrupted. And really, it's only ever your building, your people, your supply chain, or your third parties, and your technology. And so when you get into a business continuity plan, or someone asks you if you've got a BCP, that's really what they're after. A probing question on the carrier applications is, have you identified the recovery time objective for critical business functions within your organization? That's a tested question. They want to know how mature is your business continuity capability. Do you have a crisis management plan labeled as a BCP, or have you really gone through this intense business impact analysis that supports your ability to recover capabilities? Okay, so we went down the rabbit hole there a little bit, but hopefully you found that helpful in differentiating. I want to leave you with something that in the next slide should be on your radar or may be on your radar if you are governed or influenced by the FTC. You might recall they updated the safeguards rule last year. There was a period of adoption where you could get familiar and get ready. It becomes enforceable December of this year. And very specifically, it outlines more than just what you see here, but there are a number of requirements related to cybersecurity. Would encourage you to dig deeper into this too. They did change the definition and the scope of that rule too to apply to various size organizations or not apply to smaller. So take a look at that, and also just be ready because I'm not exactly sure what it looks like when this does become enforceable, but as we discussed earlier, this is evidence of the increased regulatory trend and what this is looking and feeling like. Okay, I would love to pass it back to the moderators or open it up for questions or however you'd like to handle this. Thank you for the time. Appreciate your engagement and your attention.
So as far as the questions go, just to interject here real quick, and we're going to go to Matt. At the end, towards the end of the presentation, you'll see Danny and myself, our email address on there. Any questions for the three speakers, please send them directly to us. We'll triage with the appropriate person and circle back with a general Q&A document that you can all look, just in case that question didn't come up in your mind at the time. But with that, just to keep things rolling, we'll kick it over to Matt Donovan from Amwins.
Thanks, Michael. So yeah, we'll just go through briefly kind of the cost of risk, what people are getting hit with, what the cyber policy does and how does it do it. Just run through a couple misconceptions, issues, and exclusions to be aware of, and then just a quick note on best practices. You can go to the next slide. And go one more. So generally speaking over the years, go back one. Yeah, generally speaking over the years, Brian touched on a lot of the big breaches that kind of hit the headlines, and the expenses that were behind a lot of these events, particularly the Targets of the world, Equifaxes of the world, are contained here. So you got all kinds of expenses that can kind of go into the gross amount that winds up getting paid. Cyber specialized attorneys, privacy attorneys are getting paid. It's probably gone up quite a bit, but back in my carrier days, we were paying $6.50 an hour, probably on the average. Some higher, some lower, depending on the parts of the country. The forensics fees can range quite a bit, but these are getting pretty expensive now with the e-discovery bills just going through the roof with more and more data for people to comb through. Notification expenses, generally $1.50, $3 per customer. There's a patchwork of 50 different state data breach notification laws. There are some federal laws pertaining to financial services industries, federal for healthcare. So it does vary a bit depending on requirements, what's considered PII. That's where the breach coach really comes in and helps identify what the response needs to look like. Credit and identity monitoring costs, $9 to $12 per redemption. This is generally offered when you lose Social Security numbers. Target was mentioned earlier, and it was kind of the first big swath of credit monitoring that was offered everywhere. It was a bit ironic when it was, because credit monitoring had nothing to do with the breach that they experienced. Credit monitoring monitors your credit for a new line of credit being established. It does not monitor fraudulent charges being experienced on current lines of credit. And when Target lost credit cards, that was the exposure. It was fraudulent charges that would be placed on those credit cards, not that the threat actors would be able to open up a line of credit in your name because they had a credit card number that belonged to you. But at the time, I think people were happy to see credit monitoring offered for some PR reasons. The big exposure to Target was the PCI fines and penalties. So any business that's taking debit and credit cards, they're subject to the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. Fines and penalties there are generally reasonable in insurance context, $50,000 to $100,000 maybe, where it gets pretty spicy, or when the banks go to claw back all the fraudulent charges experienced on the stolen cards, as well as $2.50 to reissue new pieces of plastic to each customer that had the card stolen. Then they assess the merchant, being Target in that case, for all of those expenses. So the PCI assessment is extraordinarily expensive for those types of businesses. HIPAA fines and penalties or other regulatory actions, depending on the industry vertical, can range, but they are getting a little bit more stout. And then social engineering and invoice manipulation fraud, I'll touch on that briefly in a subsequent slide, some coverages that have been bundled in with the cyber. You go to the next slide. What has materially changed in the last 18, 24 months is the epidemic of ransomware. The businesses have really started to realize how much business continuity can be affected by one of these events. And it's certainly not lost on the cyber underwriters that are paying for these events. So in my underwriting days, we paid 1 or 2 business interruption losses. Really was not an issue of the day. And at the time, cyber extortion demands were generally 5, 20. I would have fallen off my chair if I saw a $50,000 cyber extortion demand. Now they rarely are under 7 figures to start. I think there's a chicken and egg here with insurance and demands, and is it getting worse because insurance limits are available? But it is the way of the world right now. We did have 1 claim last year where the hackers were purportedly on the OFAC sanction list that Brian referenced, and ironically that claim wound up being about 4 times as expensive because we could not make the payment. It just made the business interruption loss, the data restoration loss, the forensics, everything, hardware replacement, that much more expensive. Even though the demand for in Bitcoin was very, very stout, the business continuity was much worse. So this section of the policy form is really what is driving loss severity. It's being hit frequently. It has a frequency issue right now, and it's causing underwriters to really dig in, pull back some limits. Dig in on the controls that they expect to see prior to getting on risk, and just surging rates across all industries, really, some getting hit worse than others. So yeah, cyber extortion, big demands being paid. Business interruption losses are even when you make a payment, it still might take a week or 2 to get back on your feet completely. Sometimes you make a payment and certain files are still corrupted, even if they get decrypted. There are all types of things that can happen. Hardware bricking and replacement coverage has been bundled with these policies now. This covers replacement of hardware that's been effectively rendered a brick. It's been encrypted, you can no longer utilize it, and you need to replace it. So there's some various shades of these coverages available in the marketplace. But important to note, because in an event where you're legally not allowed to make a payment, this coverage can be very, very handy. You can jump to the next slide. So to talk about money, so for years and years, cyber liability was always for data breach, and then business continuity sides of the policy that didn't get tapped that much, but now are getting tapped frequently. And then the questions started coming in from plenty of buyers, well, what about my funds? What about my money? So there's been 3 shades of coverage that got bolted onto the cyber policies that you'll find. They're borrowed from the crime marketplace. Honestly, you can sometimes find higher limits for some of these in the crime marketplace, but for the last bit, invoice manipulation fraud that I'll touch on, you can actually hit the mouse twice there and unhide these 2. Yeah, so the first coverage is funds transfer fraud, and that's where a hacker lifts the credentials that are utilized to send money, and they issue a fraudulent impersonation instruction posing as the insured to move money. Social engineering comes in with the voluntary parting of title concept, and this is where someone is duped into sending an invoice or making a payment on an invoice that the payment did not go where they thought it was supposed to go. So no one held a gun to your head. It's voluntary, but you were deceived. You received an invoice you thought were real, and you made the payment. Generally, these coverages are available for about $100,000 to $250,000 at sublimits in the cyber marketplace. If you need higher, you have to stack excess with multiple carriers or look to the crime world. And then in the last couple of years, a different scam started happening where it kind of took social engineering and turned it on its head. It's known as inverse social engineering or invoice manipulation fraud. And that's where the insured is breached, and the hacker may monitor communication between vendor, client, and the insured. And then when they know a client is expecting an invoice, they utilize the insured's email system to send that invoice, and the client is the one who's socially engineered, but they're socially engineered through the use of the insured's email system. So for a more robust cyber policy, you can get coverage for that scenario as well. You do need to be careful on the social engineering one. There are various markets that quote this coverage that has an out-of-band verification or a callback requirement that basically says if you did not call a known number or try to verify this transaction in an out-of-band format, something that's not in the direct communication that's requesting the money, and you sent the funds, then no coverage is there. So you do have to be careful that there's not a gotcha hidden on page 70 somewhere, written in Braille. That's where they tend to hide these things. Go to the next slide. Yeah, you can let this all pop out. So the cyber policy structure, it fits together like a puzzle. So there are a number of different coverages that may or may not be triggered based on the type of event that you've experienced. So first off, you have an actual or suspected event. Every one of these cyber policies comes with a 24-hour breach response hotline. If you're buying a standalone cyber policy, that'll be manned by an attorney. So you get a little veil of attorney-client privilege to air out some of the dirty laundry, had some end-of-life equipment on the network, forgot to apply an update, had a rogue employee issue, whatever it might be. And then they're going to quarterback this response with the approved vendor panel from the carrier. So breach cost coverage, that section of the policy is going to cover notification credit monitoring type issues. Privacy and network security is going to cover your liability when people sue for identity theft, sue for the wrongful use of your network, sue for emotional distress because their financial condition's been exposed or whatever they allege due to a data breach. Cyber extortion funds the actual ransom payment itself. Cyber business interruption is going to cover your net income and extra expenses lost during downtime due to a cyber event. Important to note that the self-insured retention or deductible in this coverage is usually a time window instead of a dollar value. So you'll see 8, 10, 12 hours or more that you need to retain yourself. And then from there, you can start collecting the business interruption losses. When you do trigger multiple insuring agreements, you want to make sure that your policy has a clause in it that says only the largest applicable retention will apply so that you don't get hit with a new self-insured retention for each one of these insuring agreements that you hit. Data restoration covers the cost to restore data. Again, there can be a couple gotchas to be aware of in these. You need to make sure that the policy does not require that the data is subject to regular backups. And that can be an issue where they can find a way to exclude coverage. Multimedia liability kind of got bundled in over the years, generally covers you for copyright, trademark type issues in your advertising, your website, or your promotional materials. Jump to the next slide. You can expand all these. So then these are the coverages that are slightly more modern. They've been in the cyber marketplace for quite a while now, but they were not really a part of the initial suite of coverages. So you've got various shades of business interruption. The original shade was business interruption. You get hit with an attack and you're down. The next concept is system failure. So you had a system outage, you applied an update and it wasn't compatible with another part of the tech stack, some other kind of outage that's not critical infrastructure in nature, which is excluded by everybody. But it's a non-malicious outage. You can cover business interruption losses for a system failure event. And then same two concepts, but in your cloud providers. Dependent system failure, dependent business interruption. What if I'm reliant on this hosted platform to run my business and they have one of these issues and then therefore I can't run my business? I've got a business interruption loss to claim there. And we've kind of touched on most of these others. There are some shades of the one that I'll touch on here is the funds held in escrow. There are a couple markets that do a really good job in spelling out if you're holding funds in escrow that is encompassed within the social engineering coverage. Definitely be careful with any wording that really governs who the money needs to be going to or who it's coming from, whose care, custody, control it's in. Especially in the mortgage industry, you can get some gotchas there where the type of scheme or type of fraud falls slightly outside of what the coverage is geared to do. So just important to note that you dive into that wording and make sure it works for your exposure. The last one I'll touch on this slide is there are very few policies in the marketplace that will trigger this. We work with a company called AdVay pretty frequently that does a nice job on this coverage, but newer data breach laws do not necessarily require data breaches. A lot of them can start fining you for wrongful collection, wrongful storage, did not allow for certain opt-out provisions. And a lot of these policies, the significant majority of them are triggered by a data breach. So if you got hit with the CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act claim, and you didn't have a data breach, well, you haven't triggered your policy yet. So that can be problematic as well, and really, really specific carriers that will actually extend coverage to those exposures. Next slide. So some common misconceptions to go through. First off, we use the cloud, so we're good. This has been a real problem for about a decade now, is the misconception that if you send data to someone else, it's their problem. The easiest example happened very recently. It was Quest Diagnostics and LabCorp had all of their data from presumably drug tests and blood tests and everything else that they do stored with a firm called AMCA. AMCA suffered a data breach, 12 million records exposed. They filed for bankruptcy a week later. The data owner was still Quest Diagnostics and LabCorp, so they're the ones that are on the hook. Same scenario really for any business. If I go to get a mortgage, I'm sending my documents to somebody, he in turn is passing them on to somebody else. That liability does not necessarily get passed on to somebody else. And if you look at the contracts and all of these cloud engagements, I believe, which is on the next slide, they'll include something along this. We and our service suppliers and licensors do not warrant that the cloud services will be uninterrupted, error-free, completely secure, or that all defects will be corrected. You acknowledge we do not control or monitor the transfer of data over the internet, and that internet accessibility carries with it the risk that your privacy, confidential information, property may be lost or compromised. And then they say liability, whether in contract, tort, or strict liability, will not exceed the total amount you actually paid to us for the cloud services. So even the AWSs and Microsofts of the world, they've got huge balance sheets, but not balance sheets big enough to indemnify Earth, and that's effectively who's going into their environment. So they have some of the most onerous contract provisions to protect themselves if something does go wrong. Next slide. A couple things to just be aware of in these policies. Are your breach costs on a reimbursement basis, or will the carrier fund those costs on your behalf? You want to make sure that you've got full prior acts coverage, so that if there's something that's undetected and you find it for the first time during the policy period, you've got coverage. Touched on the data restoration issues. Any kind of wording that talks about excluding claims resulting from wear and tear of digital assets, that's basically a failure to patch exclusion. How they define personally identifiable information, how they define your network, if the carrier is stating your data must be stored here in order for it to be covered. Things to be aware of, and then a lot of the breach of contract exclusions that are floating in these policy forms as well. Think about any non-disclosure confidentiality agreements that you might be signing, and make sure that your insurance policy is in line with those agreements that you are engaging in. Next slide. Just got two quick more for me. So standard requirements over the years for anyone who's been through the cyber underwriting process. If you were in healthcare, you needed to be HIPAA compliant, PCI compliant if you were taking credit cards, regular encryption of sensitive data, patching, updates, antivirus backups. It was fairly straightforward. In the new world, multi-factor authentication is the do not pass go, do not collect $200 question in the cyber world. So every underwriter wants to see MFA now, and that's when you type in the login and password, you get one extra form of credentialing that's required to log in, whether that be an authenticator app, a text message with a one-time use code that's good for a few minutes. But basically the concept is if someone exploits the password and the username, they still can't gain access to the account because they need this other form of authentication. Underwriters want to see this on email, remote access, all privileged admin accounts, and backups access. If you're missing it in any one of those areas, likely facing ransomware sublimits that'll apply to that entire peril, not just the ransom paid, but all your business interruption losses, anything that stems from a ransomware event will likely be subject to a pretty paltry sublimit. Endpoint detection and response, the larger the organization applying for coverage, the more increased scrutiny there is on underwriting controls. EDR is another one, business continuity plans, disaster recovery plans, and cloud-based backups and or air-gap backups with multiple copies, so that in theory, there's a way to recover. However, I think my most recent 2 ransomware events we've had, there was data exfiltration and a threat to publish. So backing up the data didn't do us any good because we still wound up having to make a payment. Last slide coming up for me. Best practices, communicate early and implement controls as needed. Get those applications in early. You'll have a ransomware supplemental this year, and hopefully work with someone that'll pre-screen it before sending it out for underwriting. Make sure that you got everything that you need to get a good response. Touched on MFA. Large accounts, step it up. If you're a really large organization, they want to see 24/7 security operations center, really buttoned up privileged account management controls. If you previously bought a 10 mil limit, it's likely being cut to 5, so you need a little extra time to build some excess layers. And really just put your best submission forward. The days of, this answer, we might be able to fix it, or can you give me a quote with or without these controls, kind of behind us right now. Underwriters are digging in. So really want to have your best submission forward when you enter the marketplace. And then lastly, if you don't have MFA and you're up on the expiration date, you got to buy coverage anyway, get implementation dates or target implementation dates where you think it's going to be done, so that we can share that with underwriting and hopefully secure an agreement to increase any ransomware sublimits midterm once those controls are in place. And that's it for me.
Great. Michael, I guess I'll go ahead and get going. My name is Michelle Bushman, and I'm the CIO at American Pacific Mortgage. American Pacific Mortgage is a nationwide independent mortgage bank, average of about $25 billion a year. Of course, we expect that to be a bit lower this year. I'm sure all of you are experiencing the same thing we are. I have been with American Pacific Mortgage for 8.5 years, and I've been in the mortgage space, I hate to say, I'm just going to say over 25 years. And I've held a variety of positions. I'm a little bit different. Even though I'm a CIO, I grew up in the business side of the organization. So I've actually also processed underwritten loans, ran capital markets, did processing. I started my career in mortgage as a junior doctor years ago. So come at it at a little bit different perspective, in that I mostly grew up on the business side and kind of leaned into the technology as I found my passion. You can go ahead and move slides, please. So what I thought might be helpful for a lot of you is, from a lender's perspective, how do you do this? I remember, early on at American Pacific Mortgage, just trying to eat and absorb as much information and knowledge as I could as I was working on building our security program. It can be a bit overwhelming when first of all, what you're up against, as my colleagues have said, it's a constantly evolving threat. What you do today doesn't mean that that's going to help you tomorrow. So it's a bit overwhelming. And so what I thought I could do is just kind of focus on a few things that could help you get started or help you augment what you might already have in place. So the first thing that you need to do is to make sure you have executive leadership and board alignment on the importance of the initiative and how much it's going to cost. This has always been a challenge. I can tell you over the last 5 years, it's gotten a lot easier. If your board and your leadership team aren't asking you about cybersecurity, if you're on the IT side, they're a bit behind and you need to start educating them. But really, you just need to get that leadership alignment to understand that it's an investment, kind of like insurance, right? People like to say it's not if and when. You may not have a huge issue. You may have a small issue that comes up, but it needs to be visible out there, and everybody needs to be aligned that it's important and that you do need to put budget dollars towards this. If you are a smaller lender, and like I said, American Pacific's grown over the years, but when I first started, we were fairly small team. Finding cybersecurity resources out in the marketplace, good luck. Even some of the providers have a constant churning door because there's not enough of these experts and these workers for the need that we have out in the marketplace. So my recommendation is from a smaller organization is finding a trusted partner or advisor, such as a managed security services partner, where they can help you walk through your infrastructure, what you've got going, and make sure that you're putting all of the controls you need to in place. And they're doing that 24/7, 365 SOC monitoring for you if you have a smaller team. They have the cyber analyst to be looking at the intel that you're getting from your systems. And that's worked very well for American Pacific Mortgage. We have a managed services provider, and what we've been able to do with that partnership is educate our team and get them to be experts on security in their day-to-day work. as well as, always having that additional resource out there that's constantly watching, whereas my team can then be focused on, helping the business continue to grow and operate on a day-to-day basis. One of the things that I will tell people, again, when you talk about the overwhelming of, you look at all these controls you need to have in place, right, on your organization, and it's gotten even more difficult with COVID and now hybrid work with remote workers, right? That risk has extended even more so than it was before, because you no longer have control of that network. What I like to tell people is just start with the basics, right? The number one thing you can do today that will help reduce your risk, make sure you're patching your endpoints, right? Things that are just the basics, the basic hygiene of standard, good practices in IT management and systems management will help secure you. If you're not familiar with that, I know a couple of the colleagues here have talked about different frameworks that you can look to help get that information. There's so many out there. The Center for Internet Security, or CIS controls, are very wide and broadly known. They're pretty straightforward. I've shared those on the screen here of what those different controls are, but there's a ton of different frameworks. You've got the NIST framework, which we talked about earlier. FFIEC has a framework. You have the ISO 27001. So there's lots of different frameworks you can go to find information. And what I recommend is, look through that as an organization, decide on which framework you want to follow to build your security program. Again, working with that trusted advisor or partner to help you understand what that means and what you need to get into place. The other things I like to recommend is making sure you're subscribing to get alerts. My favorite place to go, again, being in scrappy mode for our economics right now in our marketplace, is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. It's a government agency. They are great at sending out alerts when there are things that you need to be aware of, new threats on ransomware, new viruses. They even send out information around, from a consumer's perspective, as far as the holidays, having all the types of phishing campaigns that happen. And it's great. They also send a weekly recap of all of the vulnerabilities of a lot of the different softwares or systems that you're using. So that is a great way to stay, getting something in your inbox that will alert you to challenges. A lot of great information to help you build your security program. They've got a lot of templates, a lot of guides too, as we talk about ransomware, of how to recover from ransomware and how to prepare for not getting hit by ransomware, or if you do, what are you going to do? Another place that's really good from a financial services place is FS-ISAC. That one, depending on the organizational size, there can be a fee to participate, and it's also free, depending on your size. But another great place where it's information sharing on cyber activity and what financial services individually is actually seeing. What are the threats that are coming in? What are the common things? It's really about sharing that information across the entities so that we all can be more protected and protect our businesses and our consumers that we serve. Also, making sure you have a defense in depth program. I'm sure many of you have heard that. It's not just one layer of security, it's multiple. And when you go through these critical controls, you'll see how they pile upon each other to get you to a very nice multi-tiered security profile. And the other thing that I really like to stress too is partnering with your enterprise risk and compliance team. This is not just, to the point that our colleague said, it's not just an IT issue, right? It is an organizational risk issue. Just like your compliance looks at from the lending perspective. It's the same sort of discussion to have. And, as an organization, this is a destination, not a destination, but a journey, right? You're never going to be done. It's a constant, as things change in the marketplace as far as how the cyber actors are approaching and the different threats that come up, you have to change direction on how you're trying to mitigate those. And so you really need that partnership from your risk and your compliance team to align on what the risk is to the business, so that it's not just IT saying, hey, we need to mitigate this risk, there's a cost to it or a resource cost, here's what it means to the organization. You really need to work with your risk management and compliance teams around that, since they kind of own the risk to the business through that business impact analysis, right? So it really is a partnership working with your risk and compliance teams to make sure that you're aligned on how you're approaching it, how you speak to the board, and getting their participation. One of the things I know that our team occasionally will get frustrated with is like, we really need to get all this done tomorrow. But if we did that and put all these security and technical controls in place, business may not be able to operate very efficiently, right? So there is always this balance as well to what controls you put in to your business user experience. And the other piece that comes into there is, are you willing to take that risk? So those are the kinds of conversations I enjoy having with our risk team, is like, hey, this is a control we want to put in, but we know it's going to impact our users or their productivity. Let's talk about this control. What is the risk of us doing this or not doing this, and is it acceptable by the organization to take on that risk? Or is it a requirement that we need to do to meet investor or regulatory, or for that matter, cybersecurity policy insurance? And then how do we do that with the least impact to the business? And then one of the other scrappy ways that I like to work to continue to help me build out my security roadmap, because again, like I said, it's a journey, not a destination, is leveraging those audits. We all have audits that we have either through state licensing, our investors like Freddie and Fannie, and maybe some of our warehouse banks. Leverage those audits to help get you intel, and leverage the knowledgeable folks on that side of the table, to really hear how other people are doing it, what your options are, and help make your roadmap that you've built, validate it. Am I focused on the right items in the next order that will make the most difference to our organization? Or is this one thing I'm trying to solve really doesn't move the needle, right? It doesn't really reduce the risk, particularly in declining volumes as we get a little tighter on resources and budgets. Making sure that you're focusing on the most impactful items that you can actually accomplish. The way I use the audits, like I said, we also have internal audits. So, our risk and compliance team doing the internal audits, working partnership with them, making sure we're aligned on the most important items. The other thing that we do at APM is when we do our pen testing, every other year we kind of shift it up a little bit. So aside from just our, internal, external, wireless, and application pen testing, we will do a social engineering test one year where we actually have our testers coming on site, trying to get into the building, trying to look for people leaving things on their desk, trying to get into computers. That is one thing we do, which helps us beef up physical security and really get real life examples to show the business, hey, this can happen. We talk about it, but look, it really can happen in a safe way, right? And then on the opposite year, so we switch vendors every other year just to get different perspectives and approaches, is we do actually a security maturity assessment. And what that does is it helps align our product roadmap of how we're building out our security program to the maturity where we have the highest risks. So again, it's just another sounding board to make sure you're focused on the right things and you're making progress every year. And it's also a great thing to bring to the board to show them a third-party assessment of where we sit from a security perspective, to highlight the great work you've done, and then also to show the need of where we still need investment budget and where we still have organizational risk. I also leverage peer relationships, especially with core vendors. I'm sure a lot of you who are lenders, know that ICE, the Encompass application is very widely used in our area, and they have great resources. I spent many a times talking with their CISO to get advice on how to improve my own program, and they've been really gracious. A lot of them are wanting to help. So, if you don't have budget to go out and hire a trusted advisor, look to your colleagues and your peers and get some advice and suggestions there as well. And let's go ahead and go kind of some key takeaways that I want to share with you on the way out is, one, again, I can't say it enough, partner with your risk and compliance team for implementation of your program. Ongoing education. I didn't talk about that a whole lot, but that is huge. That is one of the probably least expensive things that you can do for your organization to move the needle is your end users. They are your largest threat to the organization, and not because it's intentional, it's unintentional. The email they get every day, they get busy. Did they click on it? The more you can educate your folks, the less likely they are just going to click on something or make that decision to wire those funds. And even if they did, it might hit them a few minutes later. Ooh, I remember seeing that or hearing about that. Maybe I need to make a phone call and make sure that was accurate. And this is not something, I'm a big believer, there's always that annual requirement for training. It's not once a year, guys. It's all the time. We do monthly newsletters. I leverage the CISA alerts during the holiday season or during tax season to actually send out security alerts to the organization to let them know about consumer-facing types of attacks that might be going, especially around phishing. Anytime you have some sort of tragedy or anything, they're out there trying to, click here to donate, to support these folks, right? Anytime you can also correlate that security training to their personal life of how they can be more safe in their personal banking, their personal computer use, it makes them better as a business user as well. So I can't say enough about education. We talked about making that roadmap and making the investment plans so that you can annually continue to mature your program. You can't do it all overnight, guys. You just can't. Again, find those areas that you need that are the most value, that will close the gap the fastest, and just, work with your board and your executive team to get that budget. Choose your tools wisely. You can end up with way more tools and way more information than you can do anything with. So again, when you're working with your advisors, make sure you're picking those security tools where you have the largest gaps or where you need the most surveillance, and that you can actually do something with the alerts or the data that you get back. That's one of the challenges, is there can be so much noise and so much information that gets from multiple tool sets that you really can't do a lot with it, because it would take a team of 12 every day to make sure they're looking at every single dashboard and alert that you might get. So I like to say that. I forget what the actual, at one point, I think they were saying that, a lot of larger organizations probably have in excess of 80 different cybersecurity softwares or tools they're using, and that's just unrealistic for smaller organizations to do. We talked about balancing security with usability for your customers' employees. I will say it, if you don't do that, they're going to find a way around it, and you're going to have a problem. Also, make sure they feel like they can partner with you. IT tends to get the cop, and the no. We say no and we're the cop, right? Be their partner. We don't want to stop you from being productive. Our job is to make you more productive. We want you to do business the way that it's easiest for you. All we ask is for you to partner with us if it's something that's not standard, so that we can find a way for you to do what you want to do securely, so that we can protect your reputation, particularly when I talk about loan officers. Their reputation and their customers is number one, right? If they had a breach and they had to send a breach notice to all of their customers, that's going to impact their business. So we're here to support them to make sure their reputation and their business is secure, and that their customers are protected. It's not about us just saying no, we don't want you to do that. So really partnering with them is critical. And then lastly, again, it's not a destination but a journey. This is something that you'll continually do, and it changes. And so I think that's what I'll leave you with. I know we're a few minutes over, but thank you for your time.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for attending today. Would like to say thank you to Michelle, Brian, and Matt for their expertise and the topics that they went through thoroughly today. As Michelle said, we're a little bit over the time slot. So what we'd like to do from a question and answer perspective is, whether you email myself or Michael Snelling, our emails are danny.gemma, Gemma, @hubinternational.com, or michael.snelling @hubinternational.com. or even possibly over to Sam as well. But what we'll do is we'll get answers to all your questions congregated in one nice email, and we'll get that back out to you with the presentation included. Would like to thank the California Mortgage Bankers Association, Sam, Susan, the team, our sponsor, Monica McCarthy at Crosscheck, and we hope to see a lot of you next week at Western Secondary. So Michael and myself will be there. If you have any questions, you want to talk boring insurance stuff about cyber over a drink, it's always better in that format. But anyways, thank you to everybody today. Wishing you a great weekend, and everybody stay safe. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.